What's going on, everybody? I'm Johnny Brook. Welcome back to another Crafted Workshop video. In today's video, I'm going to show you how to build this walnut and leather stool. So this is a really simple project. It was my first time ever doing leatherworking and I had a ton of fun. Definitely will not be my last time, but this turned out to be a very comfortable stool. Great to kind of keep in a corner, extra seating. Also be great to put your feet up. You could put magazines on it. There's all kinds of use cases for this. So had a lot of fun building this. Hopefully you guys enjoy. Let's get started. So I built this project out of rough walnut that I already had on hand, but I designed this project to work with 1x2s or 1x3s from your local home center. Now, I would definitely recommend going with a hardwood species on this project, something like oak or walnut, rather than pine, just because you'll need all the strength you can get since this is a seat. I started by milling up my walnut, but obviously if you buy lumber from your home center, you can skip this step. And next I cut my pieces to size. There are 4 pieces that make up the legs and then 2 stretchers that connect the legs. And I'll have exact measurements in the build article, which is linked to in the video description below. The legs are cut with a 45-degree miter on one end, which creates the foot, and I definitely recommend setting up a stop block when cutting these so that all your pieces are the exact same length. With the pieces cut to size, I started laying out the joinery. So the legs are connected in an X shape using half-lap joinery, and half-laps are a great joint for beginners as they're easy to create with pretty basic tools yet are extremely strong. Basically, you just cut away half of each piece and the 2 pieces fit together in the cutaways. So to cut my half-laps, I used my table saw, but these could be cut using a miter saw that has a depth stop, which most that I've seen have, or even a circular saw and a speed square. I also cut these with a regular blade on my table saw just to illustrate that you don't need a dado stack, although that certainly speeds things up. So I made sure to get my fit just right, taking my time to sneak up on the exact fit, and I used a spacer block on my table saw fence to set the position so all the joints lined up perfectly. I also made all the cuts on each board before moving the fence. So with all the waste cleared away, you can see how the pieces fit together here. With the legs fit, next I needed to cut the dados that will house the stretchers. To make this process quicker and to make sure all the joints were in the same spot, I taped all 4 legs together and then laid out the locations of the joint. I set the depth of my table saw blade using the stretcher itself and then started making cuts, again sneaking up on the fit to make sure it was nice and snug. Once the fit was right, I cleared out the rest of the waste and the joinery was done. So with the legs still taped together, I went ahead and drilled the holes that the dowels would be attached through later. I needed an extra long drill bit for this, and as luck would have it, the only extra long drill bit I own is a 1/4 inch, and that's the size I needed. So I drilled this hole on the drill press to make sure it was nice and straight, but a handheld drill would also get the job done. Next I cut my dowels to length at the miter saw. I originally used a 2-inch dowel that I picked up from my local home center, and these dowels needed to be cut to fit between the legs. With the dowels cut, I traced the outline of the dowel on the legs and then drew a slightly smaller radius with a compass. Next, I just sanded my line using an oscillating belt sander. A regular belt sander or even a file could get the job done here. I also rounded over the points of the feet while I was at it. While the base was still disassembled, I went ahead and sanded everything with 120 grit sandpaper. Be careful here though, as removing too much material will make your joints have gaps. The glue up was pretty uneventful. I just applied glue to both sides of the half laps and added a clamp to each joint. You definitely want plenty of glue in these joints as they're pretty much the only structural support of this chair. And after clamping everything up, I just wiped away any extra glue squeeze out. Next I needed to drill holes in the center of the dowels for the threaded inserts, which I'll be using to attach the dowels to the legs. And I learned this trick to find the center of a circle. You draw a few straight lines around the edges of the circle, and these are actually called chords. And you measure and mark the center of each of these lines, and then use a square to draw a line square to the chord. And where the lines you just drew intersect is the center of the circle. So pretty cool little trick there. So with the center found, I drilled the holes using my drill press, and I had to start with a smaller bit since the size I needed for the threaded inserts was too long of a bit. These dowels just fit under my drill press, but you could certainly do this with a handheld drill if your drill press isn't tall enough. So next I drilled out the hole to the correct size for my threaded inserts, and then I installed the inserts. To do this, I threaded a bolt into the insert itself, added a little CA glue to the outside of the insert, and then threaded the insert into the hole. These are pretty simple to install and are really strong. The sizing on these is 1/4-20, and the bolts I used were 2-inch 1/4-20 brass bolts, which I just like the look of. With the dowels installed, I measured for the leather seat, and I used a piece of string to represent the leather here, but in retrospect I didn't leave enough slack in my measurement, and my leather seat ended up a little short width-wise later on. So for the leather, I used a nice big piece of 9-ounce leather that I picked up from Tandy Leather in Atlanta a few weeks ago, and this whole hide was only $50. So if you've been putting off getting into leather working because of the cost, I was actually really surprised to find some of the deals you can get on leather. And if you're going to build a stool like this for yourself, definitely make sure to get at least 8 or 9 ounce leather, because anything thinner will just have the risk of tearing over time. So to cut the leather to size, I just used a basic utility knife with a nice sharp blade and a framing square, and my piece ended up at around 31 inches by 16.5 inches. Next, I rounded the corners just to give the piece a more finished look, again just using a utility knife. To give the edges of the leather a cleaner look, I used an edge beveler to add a round over to the top and bottom edges. And this was one of the most satisfying parts of leatherworking. Just watching those little curls of leather roll off, leaving me with a nice clean edge, it was super satisfying. With the edges beveled, I went on to slicking the edges, which gives them a really nice clean look. It's super simple, you just dab a little water onto the edges and then run a wood slicker, in my case, over the edge a few times. And basically the friction and moisture cause the edge to get nice and shiny and perfectly rounded. Also, don't be intimidated by the cost of the leather tools themselves. I think all the tools I used in this project were less than $40. So with the piece of leather all cleaned up, I laid out the area for the barge cement, which is what I used to glue the leather to itself to form the loops. And make sure to check your measurements here, because as I said, I accidentally made my leather seat too short during this process and ended up having to switch from 2-inch to 1-inch dowels to allow the leather to fit. So I applied the barge cement, adding just a thin layer across the entire surface of the area I had laid out, and then let it dry for about 20 minutes. This lets the barge cement set up, and then I clamped it together, making sure not to clamp too hard, otherwise you'll accidentally emboss the surface of the leather. After the barge cement dried overnight, I applied a few coats of pure neat's foot oil, which is a leather conditioner. It goes on really dark, and I was actually really unhappy with how it looked at first, but after 24 hours, it absorbed really evenly into the leather and lightened up quite a bit. So next I laid out the holes for the rivets, and I wanted them to be evenly spaced and in a straight line, mainly just for aesthetic reasons. I used a round drive punch to cut the holes for the rivets to go through. And for the rivets, I'm using an Arrow Fastener RH200S heavy duty rivet tool, along with Arrow rivets and washers on this project. So Arrow Fastener is the sponsor of this week's video, and they make a wide variety of fastening tools, including staple guns, nailers, glue guns, riveters, and more. So I've got a ton of projects featuring Arrow tools coming up, so stay tuned for that. And if you'd like to learn more about Arrow Fastener, check out the link in the video description below. So with the rivets installed, I moved on to finishing the stool, first sanding it up to 180 grit, and there were a lot of little corners on this base that made it pretty tricky to sand, but one of these little sanding sponges really helped clean everything up. So for the finish, I applied 3 coats of a wipe-on polyurethane, sanding between coats with 400 grit sandpaper. And after the finish dried, I installed the seat by threading the bolts into the threaded inserts in the dowels. And I definitely recommend adding a washer beneath the bolt head here just to help reinforce this connection. And with the seat installed, the stool was done. All right, hopefully you guys enjoyed this one. This was a lot of fun, and I am really happy with the way this turned out. The base itself was pretty simple. Did have some half laps and dados to contend with, but they all turned out really nice and tight. It's very strong. Let me sit down on this real quick just to show you. I mean, it very easily supports my 190-pound weight. So definitely very strong. You could add dowel pins if you wanted to further reinforce the joints, but I don't think they're necessary. The leather turned out beautifully. I love the rivets. I think it really adds a nice touch to it. Also, if you don't already, go ahead and get subscribed. I put out new project videos like this every Tuesday, and I have links to all the materials and tools I used in the video description below. Also, big shout out to my Patreons. Thank you guys so much for the support. All right, thanks again for watching, guys, and until next time, happy building.